Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into a specific ancient text, 1 Kings chapter 9.
That's right.
It's a really packed chapter focusing on King Solomon, right around what seems like the height of his reign.
A definite peak, yes.
So our goal here is to explore the insights, the key events, and the messages this chapter lays out about, well, his achievements and maybe the divine view on them.
And it jumps right in, doesn't it? With a major divine interaction.
Exactly. We're starting right there. The Lord appearing to Solomon just after he finished these enormous building projects.
Yeah, the timing is significant. The text sets it up. Solomon had just finished building the temple of the Lord.
His father David's dream project.
Right, the one David wanted, but Solomon executed. And he'd also finished his own, pretty extensive royal palace.
And the text really emphasizes that he'd done everything he wanted to do with these buildings.
It does. It says he achieved all he had desired to do. It's like the culmination of, 20 years of work?
Happy years, yeah.
And right then, in that moment of huge accomplishment, the Lord appears to him again, a second time.
And it explicitly links back to the first time.
Yes, it mentions the previous appearance at Gibeon, where Solomon famously asked for wisdom. This is presented as a follow-up of sorts.
Okay, so the buildings are done, standing tall, symbols of power, devotion, and God shows up.
Yeah.
How does this connect to Solomon's big prayer back in chapter 8 when he dedicated the temple?
Well, the divine voice basically says, I've heard your prayer, the one you made before me. So the temple is validated. It's consecrated.
Consecrated how?
By God's name being placed there forever. That's the language used.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that really powerful phrase, my eyes and my heart will always be there.
Wow. So in the view of this text, the temple isn't just stone and gold.
No, it's meant to be this permanent focus point of divine attention, divine presence, right there on earth.
That's a huge affirmation, a massive blessing. But what comes next in the text feels very different. It's not just unconditional blessing, is it?
No, not at all. There's a big if. The promise about the temple, about Solomon's dynasty continuing, it's all tied to obedience, explicitly.
Okay, spell that out. What's the condition?
The text says, if Solomon walks before the Lord with integrity, with uprightness.
Like his father David.
Exactly, like David his father specifically says. And if he obeys all that God commands, the decrees, the laws, everything, then and only then will his royal throne over Israel be established forever.
So it echoes that promise made to David.
Directly. You shall never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. But the key thing here is that the permanence for Solomon and his line is totally contingent on their behavior.
The promise is huge, an eternal dynasty, but it's hanging by the thread of human faithfulness.
Precisely.
So what's the flip side? What if they don't meet the condition? What's the warning?
The consequences laid out are, well, they're devastating.
Yeah.
If Solomon or his sons turn away, ignore the commands, and this is critical, go serve other gods, worship them.
Idolatry, the big one.
The big one. Then the divine response is just catastrophic.
Yeah.
Israel gets cut off, exiled from the very land they were given.
And the temple, the one just consecrated.
Rejected, cast out of God's sight, despite the promise of his name being there forever. And Israel itself, they become, the text says, a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples.
From chosen nation to a global laughingstock.
Yeah, imagine that transition. It's stark.
It really is a complete reversal tied directly to their actions in this divine message. And the text even makes you picture the aftermath, doesn't it? After the potential destruction happens.
It does. It paints this specific scene. The temple, even though it's described as imposing right now.
Oh, inspiring.
Right. But the text says, in the future, people passing by its ruins will be appalled. They'll scoff. They'll ask, why? Why did the Lord do this to this land, to this temple?
And the text gives the answer right there. It doesn't leave you hanging.
No, it provides the exact explanation those future people will supposedly give. Because they forsook the Lord their God.
The one who brought them out of Egypt.
Who brought their fathers out of Egypt. And they embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them.
So the text presents it as direct cause and effect. Break the covenant, embrace other gods.
And disaster follows. National destruction, temple destruction. It's presented very clearly.
It really drives home the weight of this divine interaction. Huge blessing, but with incredibly high stakes. Okay, so with that, that profound spiritual warning hanging in the air, the chapter pivots.
Right back down to earth.
Yeah, to the very earthly business of how Solomon actually built all this stuff. It mentions the temple and the palace took 20 years.
20 years. That number alone tells you something about the scale, the sheer duration of these projects.
Yeah.
It wasn't quick.
And projects like that need resources. Which brings us to the deal with Hiram, king of Tyre.
Right. Hiram was the supplier. He provided Solomon with, well, vast amounts of materials, all the cedar, the pine, the gold Solomon wanted for these huge buildings.
And in return,
Solomon gave Hiram 20 towns up in Galilee.
land for resources. Seems straightforward. But the text adds this little detail about Hiram's reaction. He wasn't impressed.
No, not at all. It specifically says, when Hiram came down from Tyre to check out his new towns, he was not pleased with them.
And he actually says something.
He does. He says, "What kind of towns are these you have given me, my brother?" And kind of as a lasting sign of his disappointment, he names the area the land of Kabul.
Kabul. What does that mean?
Well, the name sounds a lot like the Hebrew word for worthless, or maybe binding or pledged. It strongly suggests Hiram felt he got, the short end of the stick on that deal.
Huh. A little bit of ancient political realism tucked in there.
Yeah, it shows the relationship wasn't just smooth sailing. And speaking of the scale of the deal, the text also mentions the gold Hiram sent.
How much was it?
120 talents of gold. Now, a talent was a massive unit of weight. We're talking about an enormous fortune in gold just from this one exchange with Hiram.
Okay, so resources secured partly through trade, partly through maybe slightly disappointing town swaps. But what about the labor? These projects needed hands, lots of them.
And the chapter is very clear about where that labor came from. It talks about the forced labor King Solomon conscripted.
Who is doing this forced labor?
The text lists the projects first. The temple, his palace, the supporting terraces, often called the Millo, the wall around Jerusalem, and then key cities, Hazor, Megiddo, Gezer.
Strategic locations.
Very strategic, controlling trade routes, defense points, and there's that interesting side note about Gezer.
Ah, yes, the one involving Pharaoh.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The text explains Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had actually captured Gezer, burned it down, killed the Canaanite population.
And then gave it as a wedding present.
Pretty much. Gave it as a wedding gift to his daughter when she married Solomon. So Solomon then had to rebuild it.
So it wasn't just the strategic build, it was tied into his marriage alliance, rebuilding his wife's dowry city, essentially.
Right. It shows how personal life, diplomacy, and building projects were all intertwined.
And the list of building projects goes on beyond those main cities.
Oh, yeah. Lower Beth Horon, Belanth, more strategic spots controlling routes up to Jerusalem. Tadmor, which is Palmyra, way out in the desert.
Key for Eastern trade.
Definitely. And then just generally, all his store cities, places for supplies, logistics, towns for his chariots and horses, a huge military buildup. The text kind of sums it up as whatever he desired to build across his whole kingdom. Jerusalem, Lebanon, everywhere.
It really paints a picture of immense ambition. But let's get back to the labor force itself. Who exactly was being forced into this work?
The text is explicit. It names the groups. All the people left from the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites.
The pre-Israelite inhabitants of the land.
The non-Israelite populations who were still living there, the ones the Israelites could not exterminate during the earlier conquest period, according to the text. These were the people Solomon conscripted for his slave labor force.
And it notes this system was ongoing.
Yes, it adds that phrase, as it is to this day, meaning from the perspective of when this was written, this system of forced labor from these specific groups was still in place.
But it draws a very clear line, doesn't it, about the Israelites themselves.
A very sharp line. It says, but Solomon did not make slaves of any of the Israelites.
So what were the Israelites doing?
They were in charge. They served as his soldiers, his government officials, his officers, captains, commanders of the chariots, the charioteers themselves, the military and administrative structure, the skilled supervision that was Israelite.
While the heavy lifting, the forced manual labor came from these other groups.
That's the picture the text presents. Authority and skilled roles for Israelites, forced labor for the descendants of the conquered peoples.
And it even gives a number for the supervisors.
Yes, 550 chief officials, specified as Israelites, who were overseeing the projects and the workforce.
And one last construction detail, the terraces connected to his wife.
Right, the text notes the supporting terraces, the Millo, were built after Pharaoh's daughter moved from the old city of David up to the new palace Solomon built for her.
So maybe it was part of integrating that new palace complex?
Possibly, yeah. Connecting it, supporting it, perhaps tied specifically to accommodating his chief royal wife in her new grand residence.
It's just fascinating how this chapter weaves together the cosmic scale of God's covenant and warnings with these really granular details, resource deals, labor management, even royal housing logistics.
It really covers a lot of ground.
And it doesn't stop with buildings and labor. It gives glimpses into other key parts of Solomon's reign, too. His religious practice, for instance.
Yeah, despite the huge focus on building the temple, the text makes a point of noting Solomon's personal worship. 3 times a year, he offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings.
Standard Israelite worship practices.
Exactly. On the altar, he built for the Lord. And it says he burned incense, too, so fulfilling the temple obligations. It shows him, at least at this stage, keeping up the expected religious duties.
Okay, and then there's the move into maritime trade. Big source of wealth in the ancient world.
A huge source. Solomon gets into the shipping business. He builds a fleet of ships down at Ezion-Geber,
Where's that?
near Elath in Edom, right on the shore of the Red Sea, a really strategic port.
Why strategic?
It gave him access south, down the Red Sea, towards Africa, maybe Arabia, potentially even further, lucrative trade routes.
And he gets help with this, again, from Hiram.
He does. He leverages that relationship again. Tyre, Hiram's kingdom, was the established sea power. They knew sailing.
So Hiram sent experienced sailors.
Yes, the text says Hiram set his own men, sailors who knew the sea, to serve in Solomon's fleet alongside Solomon's own crews. It was a joint venture. Solomon provides the port and the ships. Hiram provides the expertise.
A smart partnership. And where did they go?
They sailed to Ophir.
Ophir. Now, people debate where exactly Ophir was, right?
Oh, endlessly. Arabia, Africa, India. We don't know for sure, but the text is very clear about what they brought back.
Which was?
Gold. Lots of gold. 420 talents of it.
Wait, Hiram sent 120 talents earlier. This is 420.
420 talents delivered straight to King Solomon. If 120 was a fortune, 420 from these Ophir voyages is just astronomical wealth. It underpins all those later descriptions of Solomon's incredible riches.
So this one chapter, First Kings 9, it gives us this incredible snapshot. You've got the divine encounter promises, warnings.
Very conditional warnings.
Right. Then decades of massive building, managing this complex, partly forced labor system.
Navigating tricky international deals, swapping towns for timber and gold.
And launching these incredibly ambitious and apparently successful long-distance trading expeditions.
It really is a rich tapestry, isn't it? You see the high-level theology, the divine covenant stuff, sitting right next to the very practical, almost gritty details of running a kingdom.
The economics, the logistics, the social structure.
The alliances, the text doesn't really separate them. It just presents it all together.
When you look at all these pieces laid out here, the divine message, the huge projects, the labor issues, the pursuit of wealth, what stands out most forcefully to you from this chapter?
I think it's the tension. The tension the text deliberately creates. You have God reaffirming the promise to David there will always be a king on the throne, almost unconditionally.
Right, that seems like a guarantee.
But then immediately pivots to Solomon and his line. And suddenly it's intensely conditional. It's forever if you obey. It makes you really ponder the nature of that original promise to David, or at least how this writer understood it.
How divine guarantee and human responsibility fit together.
Exactly. And then to follow that deep theological point immediately with, haggling with Hiram over towns, or the straightforward account of conscripting people into forced labor. It forces you, the reader, to think about how those high ideals mesh with the often messy realities of building a state and holding power.
It really does. You see the sheer scale of Solomon's ambition. The cities, the walls, the palace, the port. But it's all built on these, well, complex and sometimes uncomfortable practical foundations. Resource deals, forced labor.
And yet hovering over it all is that initial divine encounter. The text keeps reminding you implicitly that all this earthly success, all this power and wealth symbolized by the gold and the buildings, it's ultimately judged by a higher standard.
That standard of faithfulness, obedience to the covenant.
Precisely. The glory is there, but so is the fragility. It's woven right in. This chapter isn't just giving facts, it's framing them theologically. Human actions, especially obedience or disobedience, have massive national consequences that can, in this view, overturn even the most impressive achievements.
So we've covered quite a bit here from 1 Kings 9, the crucial divine covenant with its stark conditions, the immense scale of Solomon's building and his labor force.
The deal-making, the trade, ventures to Ophir.
Yeah, it really paints this picture of a kingdom running on both divine mandate and human pragmatism, maybe even ambition.
It absolutely does. And it leads you, the listener, with a really powerful dynamic to think about. Here's a ruler, Solomon, who seems to have it all: success, wealth, divine communication, arguably unparalleled achievement.
At the absolute peak.
Yet the text insists, right in that moment, on the contingent nature of it all, the clear conditions, the potential for it all to be lost. So how does this text maybe challenge our own assumptions about power, about prosperity, about divine favor? It explicitly links them to this tough requirement of unwavering obedience.
Especially when faced with temptations like other gods or just the practical pressures of running a kingdom.
Exactly. So maybe think about that constant tension the chapter describes, that inherent risk described right alongside this moment of incredible success.